I direct the Center for Religious Freedom of the Hudson Institute. And I'm very glad that you could all join us. I know that there is high interest in learning more about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. This is an organization that really has escaped the notice of a lot of foreign policy observers. It came to Paul Marshall, my colleague here at the center, and my attention about 8 years ago when we were researching our book, Silenced: How Apostasy and Blasphemy Laws Are Choking Freedom Worldwide, which was published 2 years ago. We actually as we delved into it, we became more and more interested in learning about it. It is an international organization that's quite formidable. It has 56 member states. It was founded in the 70s by Saudi Arabia. It's based in, Secretariat's based in Saudi Arabia. It's largely funded by Saudi Arabia. To give you an idea, in 2008, the Saudis contributed $30 million to the OIC. And the next largest contributor was Kuwait at $3 million, and then Qatar at $1 million. So it really caught our interest, and not the least of which was the fact that it was not only working within its own body and among its own members, but it also brought a collective view or an OIC view to influence other organizations like the United Nations and the EU. In around 2000, late 90s, it started lobbying very assiduously on the issue of defamation, banning defamation against Islam. And it became particularly active after 9/11 in trying to establish, under a 10-year action plan, criminal laws that would punish blasphemy against Islam throughout the world. In 2008, this accelerated, and their work accelerated in this regard after the Danish cartoon crisis in 2005 and 2006. And by 2008, the Bush administration had appointed the first American ambassador to the OIC. President Obama also has sent an ambassador to the OIC, appointed an ambassador, and the Secretary of State under Obama, for the first time, Hillary Clinton, for the first time, began to co-chair meetings with the OIC on this issue of defamation against Islam, trying to find an elusive common ground here. I recommend to you a new book that British scholar Katja Samuel has done on the OIC, and called The OIC, the UN, and Counterterrorism Lawmaking. So this is a very useful study of the organization and processes of the OIC that just has been released. And I have a few flyers on it if you're interested. But today, I am delighted that we are joined by Dr. Mark Dury to give us further insights into the OIC, particularly as it pertains to its work against Islamophobia. Dr. Dury is an old friend of the Center for Religious Freedom. He has spoken here before. He's an Anglican pastor in Melbourne. He is a linguistics expert. He has his PhD from Australian National University in linguistics. He is a member of the Australian Academy of Humanities. He did his field work in Aceh, Indonesia, and is the leading expert in the world on Aceh's linguistics. He has written a grammar book and a dictionary on Aceh. And it was there that he began studying the theology of resistance within Islam and took an interest in interaction and the relationship between the people of Aceh along religious lines, and the treatment of non-Muslims in Aceh. He's the department head of linguistics at Melbourne University, and he was a research fellow at MIT, Stanford, and UCLA. He is also an author. He has authored 3 books on Islam. His latest is called The Third Choice, and it's, again, on the theology and practice regarding non-Muslims in the Islamic State. And that was published by Dira Books in 2009. So Mark Dury really stands at the crossroads between theology and cultural fieldwork, and it's from that expertise that he is going to speak to us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Nina. It is a pleasure to be here again at the Hudson. I'm going to be speaking about the OIC and its involvement in the national campaign to combat Islamophobia. The OIC was founded in 1969. It's based in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Today, 57 or 56 member states, depending how you count them. It is the largest global organization of states apart from the UN. The only such organization devoted to advancing a specific religion, and a very significant global voting bloc at the UN. Has very important international role in international affairs. It is a political expression of a theological ideal. According to its charter, it exists to advance the interests of the Islamic Ummah, or Muslim nation, a term that is found in the Quran. It is a global political manifestation of Islamic revivalism, that is the need to address the decline of Islam in recent centuries and to restore the greatness of Islam in the world. So its charter speaks of revitalizing Islam's pioneering role in the world and fostering noble Islamic values and to defend the universality of the Islamic religion. That is, there is a premise that the Islamic religion is under attack and needs to be defended on the global stage. It has these core constituting bodies. The Islamic Summit is a meeting of heads of states every 3 years. There is an annual meeting of foreign ministers, the Permanent General Secretariat based in Saudi Arabia, the International Court of Justice, Islamic Court of Justice, and a whole raft of associated organizations. It is, I think, in some ways modeled on the UN. It's seeking to create, in a sense, a United Nations for the global Islamic community. A very important reference point when we're speaking about human rights in the OIC is the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, produced by the OIC in 1990. It is modeled on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but has some significant differences from it. It states that the Sharia that is Islamic law or Islamic practice, is the only source for human rights. All rights are subject to the Sharia, Article 24. Islam is the guarantee for human dignity, Article 1. Life and bodily safety are protected except as allowed by the Sharia, Article 2. There is no guarantee of freedom to choose one's own religion, in contrast, for example, to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Also, freedom of expression is subject to Sharia norms, Article 22. It affirms a right in Islam to promote what is good, a Quranic phrase, and to speak against what is bad or forbidden, as defined by the Sharia. The right to freedom of speech does not extend to speech which undermines or weakens Islam or what the religion of Islam values. So this is the benchmark for the OIC in promoting human rights. In 2005, there was an extraordinary meeting of leaders from the Ummah. This is the language the OIC uses to describe this. It was convened in Mecca and led to a 10-year action plan to address challenges facing Muslims in the world today. There were a number of points, and point 7 was to combat Islamophobia, to emphasize the responsibility of the international community, including all governments, to ensure respect for all religions and combat their defamation. It's interesting, the heading of point 7 is combating Islamophobia, but it is framed in terms of defamation of all religions. There is a proposal which happened to establish an observatory at the OIC's General Secretariat to monitor globally all forms of Islamophobia and to issue an annual report, more about that later. But also to take steps to have the United Nations adopt an international resolution to counter Islamophobia and call on states to enact laws to counter it, including deterrent punishments, that is to criminalise acts of Islamophobia, and to set up a structured dialogue to project the true values of Islam and empower Muslim countries to help in the war against extremism and terrorism. That first part is quite significant. So this is a structured dialogue which allows a context for Islam to be projected, or the values of Islam to be projected into societies which are at risk of Islamophobia. Point 8 is also important. There is a call upon Islamic Conference of Foreign Ministers to establish a permanent body to promote human rights in accordance with the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. So the Cairo Declaration is the framework that the OIC is looking to, and also to seek to cooperate with international and regional organisations on behalf of the rights of Muslim minorities in non-OIC member states. This 10-year action plan resulted in a lot of activity at the UN. The OIC sponsored resolutions against defamation of religion, an important term at the Human Rights Council in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. However, it was a resolution against incitement, intolerance and negative stereotyping that got more traction at the UN, setting aside the defamation of religion language. So there was a Human Rights Council Resolution 1618 in 2011, and then this was followed up by a very similar UN resolution that was passed in December 2012. This resolution embodies the goals that were expressed in the 10-year action plan, and it acknowledges in its wording that this request is coming from the Ummah, is coming from the Islamic global community, in the sense that it says that these measures, these steps are called for by the Secretary General of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation to foster a domestic environment of religious tolerance, peace and respect. So these resolutions acknowledge that they are coming from, initiated by the Islamic community. The major points, action points of the UN resolution were to establish networks of influence across all areas of social activity, education, for example, to set up mechanisms to identify existing tensions, to document them, to train government officials in outreach particularly to the Muslim community, that's the implication. The UN resolution is couched in terms of all religions, but it's very clear from the OIC's intention that the purpose of this is to combat Islamophobia, to deal with the problems faced by one particular religion. To speak out against incitement, that is, governments and leaders should do that, to oppose negative religious stereotyping and to support a dialogue. One of the fruits of this activity was the Istanbul process, which was co-chaired by Hillary Clinton. For example, just one example, a conference held in December 2011 which emphasized combating discrimination, training officials, so a heavy emphasis on equipping, for example, US and European officials in the categories of Islamophobia and how to recognize them and deal with them. Enforcement mechanism, examining the laws that countries have, anti-incitement laws, and how to develop outreach to religious communities, particularly Islamic communities in the West. There have been a huge number of fruits from the Islamophobia campaign of the OIC, or developments. For example, at the Alliance of Civilizations Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2010, there was a roundtable on Islamophobia co-sponsored by the OIC, the Council of Europe and the British Council. There have been a series of meetings in Europe co-sponsored by the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, UNESCO and the Council of Europe, focusing on informing and training educators about Islamophobia. There was a September 2013 conference on Islamophobia in Turkey looking at law and the media, co-sponsored by the OIC and people in Turkey. There's also been the emergence of what is becoming a new discipline, Islamophobia studies, There have been international academic conferences, for example, in April at UC Berkeley, in March at Indiana University. There are university-based observatories, for example, the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley's Center for Race and Gender. There are a growing list of publications such as Same Hate, New Target, co-published by CARE and UC Berkeley's Center for Race and Gender Studies. And some states and other higher education institutions have been introducing national observatories as well. Well, what is Islamophobia? We'll shift gear. It is obviously formed by analogy with homophobia. As used in feminist and queer discourse, homophobia refers to an irrational fear grounded in insecurities about one's own sexual or gender identity. The label Islamophobia implies a deep-seated and irrational fear about Islam or Muslims, but without that implication of insecurity about one's own religious identity. A defining document in discussions of Islamophobia was produced by the Runnymede Trust in the UK. They did a consultation in 1996 after establishing a commission on British Muslims and Islamophobia and produced a document called Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All, which included recommendations for action, which have had a significant influence across public institutions in the UK. They identified what they called closed and open views on Islam. So closed views, which are symptoms of Islamophobia, are, for example, that Islam is monolithic, that it is separate and other, that it is inferior, that it is violent, that it is a political ideology, that Muslims' criticisms of the West are invalid, that hostility to Islam justifies acts of discrimination, and that anti-Muslim attitudes are normal. This definition has been criticised, and it's quite difficult to make operational to tie down some of these categories. These are just summaries. It is a contentious construct. Some non-Muslims are clearly opposed to Islam out of a xenophobic aversion to Muslims or to Islam. However, others might be opposed on the basis of disapproval or opposition to the creed of Islam, to cultures it has influenced, or to the actions of some Muslims who profess Islam. And that distinction is a really significant one, and I'll keep coming back to it. A narrow reading of Islamophobia could be that the term applies to those who have an irrational fear of Islam or Muslims, but perhaps not all objections or disapprovals of Islam might be considered to be irrational or based on prejudice. There is surely space for critique of religious ideologies that's not racist. The broad reading of Islamophobia, or the hard reading you might say, is that all expressions of opposition to or disapproval of Islam as a religion are irrational and manifestations of prejudice, either ipso facto, just by virtue of the fact that Islam is disagreed with, that must be prejudice, or as a default assumption. So if someone adopts a critical attitude, the default assumption is that they are xenophobic or motivated by hate. The OI position, understanding of Islamophobia, is that it is this is the phrase used by the OI, who was the OIC General Secretary at the time. Islamophobia is a contemporary manifestation of racism. So there is an underlying category of racism or race hatred. It manifests in different ways, such as in anti-Semitism, and now it's manifesting in the West in terms of hatred of Islam or Muslims. There is a lot of gloomy and dire language used in the General Secretary's statement. So he said it has ominous consequences. It's a threat to global peace. There's a dire need. The worst fears are being realized. There's an atmosphere of threat to the world associated with this phenomenon. And he said that the purpose of Resolution 1618 is to combat Islamophobia. He did say it's a means to an end, acknowledging that it wasn't the complete solution. We need to build on it. It's a step along the way to combating Islamophobia. The OIC has a broad reading of Islamophobia. The General Secretary of the OIC basically says that all criticism of Islam is a violation of human rights. He said, the suggestion that Islam is a problem for humanity as it is claimed in the hateful discourse of Islamophobia is to negate Islam's sublime values of peace, compassion and tolerance, and all the noble virtues that Islam has stood for throughout 14 centuries of tolerant, brilliant and radiant civilization. To attribute terrorism to Islam reflects and embodies irrational and vicious prejudices on the part of disseminators. These very allegations in fact demonstrate how important it is to produce and spread the true knowledge about Islam and Muslim communities. So what he's saying is to problematize Islam is hate speech. And there is a task before the Muslim world, indeed the world in general, to promote a positive regard for Islam as a civilizing project. So that is what I call a broad or hard interpretation of Islamophobia. It allows no room for the idea there might be a rational critique and a non-hateful critique of Islam. The OIC's observatory has been producing annual and monthly reports. These quotes are mainly from the 2013 annual report. It implies that Islamophobia is a non-Muslim conspiracy against the Muslim world. Islamophobia it has a sort of intentive purpose to destabilize social cohesion, to foment hatred and tolerance. 9/11 was a long-awaited opportunity for the anti-Islam and anti-Muslim elements in the West. They were just hanging out for 9/11 to happen, to set in motion their well-orchestrated plan to slander Islam and target Muslims by equating terror with Islam and Muslims. Islamophobia is a deliberate scheme to distort the teachings and principles. This is a war, an ideological war against a perfect and civilizing religion. There are many reported incidences and in their reports, and some of them are clear incidents of hate crimes. Women having their veils ripped off or people being physically assaulted, hateful slogans painted on religious institutions. But many of the incidents are very difficult to understand in terms of hatred. For example, Europeans who held a topless jihad day in front of Algerian embassies across Europe were protesting what they called an Islamist crackdown on Arab women's rights. That's Islamophobia. A man was held by UK police on suspicion of making a homemade bomb which exploded. That was Islamophobia on their part. There are many reports of groups opposing the construction of mosques. They're all Islamophobic. A September 2011 poll found that 47% of Americans agree that Islam is in conflict with American values. That shows Islamophobia. After the Boston bombing, some Americans claimed that the Tsarnaev brothers were brainwashed by Islamic extremists. That's an Islamophobic statement. Republican Peter King asked for authorities to increase surveillance of Muslims. That is Islamophobia. Lindsey Graham, a senator, told Fox News that those brothers were on a jihad mission. To call their activity jihad is Islamophobic. 73% of Dutch people see a relationship between Islam and terror acts. That's an Islamophobic belief. More than 80% of Germans believe that Islam deprives women of their rights. To believe that is a sign of prejudice. In the UK, some have opposed halal slaughter methods, but it is Islamophobic that they do not make the same criticism against Jewish ritual slaughter. Richard Dawkins called Islam one of the greatest evils of the world. He's an Islamophobe. Now, some objections. I want to run through a number of objections to this framework. One is, at least in the US, the situation is not dire. In annual statistics of US hate crimes published year after year, only a relatively small number are anti-Muslim. The most victimized religious group in the US is Judaism. So 674 anti-Jewish incidents in 2012 report, 130 anti-Islamic incidents, 2% of hate crimes. The large majority of hate crimes in the US are on racial grounds, not religious grounds. But most of the objections to this whole program are the lack of reciprocity and consistency. The OIC's campaign is solely targeted against the West. The observatory only considers Western incidents. So, for example, a sectarian suicide bombing of mosque in Iraq or killing of Ahmadiyya Muslims in Indonesia are not reported as Islamophobic incidents. There is also a thread of an idea that the West is hateful. So anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are two sides of the same coin, and it's an evil plague of Europe, which is full of hate, said Abdul Jalid Sajid, who's the chairman of Muslim Council for Religious and Racial Harmony in the UK. Or Anas Altikriti, chief executive of the Cordova Foundation, said Islamophobia is a tragic reality and a test to the West's claims to uphold the most noble of human values. The most egregious violations of Muslims' religious freedoms, that is both to practice or not to practice Islam. Muslims have a right to practice Islam, but they also should have the right to dissent and not to practice Islam. And the most egregious violations of the religious freedoms of Muslims are perpetrated by Muslims in the OIC states. This is at odds with the dire threat rhetoric of the OIC directed against the West. The OIC is promoting the Islamic human rights of Muslims in the West, but does nothing to curb extensive violations of non-Muslims' religious freedom in its member states. Islamic states consistently generate many examples of incitement on the grounds of religion, for example against Christians, Jews, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Baha'ites, atheists, and various Islamic sects such as Ahmadiyas. There is parallel incitement to religious hatred by some Muslim in Western states. These are so numerous and so well known that I'm not going to give examples of these here, except perhaps one, the promotion of television programs featuring the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Arabic in the Middle East be one example. Such acts of incitement are of course associated with violence and other human rights abuses against non-Muslim or sectarian Muslim groups. Also, the most persecuted religion today is Christianity. There was a British Secret Service report in 2007 that said 200 million Christians are at risk of or experiencing persecution. The OIC member states comprise 35 of Open Door's top 50 watch lists of states where Christians are persecuted. This is 60% of OIC states are on the worst 50 nations for the persecution of Christians. And on the worst 10 list, 9 are OIC states. The worst of all, of course, is North Korea. Also, specific incidents of Western Islamophobia are often exceeded by Islamic states in their treatment of non-Muslims. For example, while opposition to the building of mosques is a constant theme in OIC observatory reports as examples of Islamophobia, many Islamic states place limits on the building of non-Muslim states of worship, and Saudi Arabia does not permit a single church on its soil despite having hundreds of thousands of Christian residents. Some beliefs which the OIC Observatory Report identifies as examples of Islamophobia accord with the teachings of some leading Muslim experts on Islam, including the OIC's own scholars. For example, one of the claims that the Observatory Report of 2013 said was typical of Islamophobia was the idea that Islam is an inherently expansionist religion which strives for political influence. Now, Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who is a senior Pakistani jurist and deputy chair of the OIC's International Fiqh or Jurisprudence Academy, has written that aggressive jihad is lawful even today. Its justification cannot be veiled. We should venerate this expansionism with complete self-confidence. I'm not making a comment on whether this is a justifiable or valid interpretation of Islam. My point is that a senior OIC-linked Muslim scholar has expressed this view, while the OIC claims that people in the West who express that view are Islamophobes. The observatory report also said that Islam deprives women of their rights, and in a fatwa of domestic violence produced by the OIC through its International Fiqh Academy in 2009, it says that a husband can forbid his wife to travel alone, and he may beat his wife in accordance with Islamic legal standards. There seems to be an inconsistency between saying people in the West who say that Islam deprives women of human rights are Islamophobic, but the OIC itself, through one of its subsidiary organizations, has produced this ruling. Muslims are separate and other, the Observatory Report of 2013. And again, Muhammad Taqi Uthmani, in a fatwa produced in response to a request from an American organization for advice on whether Muslims can be naturalized citizens in the West, said that if a Muslim has obtained the nationality of a Western state for the purpose of inviting its people to Islam or to convey the legitimate rulings, that is Sharia law, to Muslims residing here, it's permissible. But if naturalization in a foreign nationality is for the purpose of rendering it mighty, or to be proud of that new nation, or to prefer it to the Muslim nationality, or to resemble its people in practical life, it is absolutely haram to be naturalized as a citizen on those grounds. So there is a statement, and there's a series of fatwas produced to this request that make similar points. This is not Islamophobic if a Muslim scholar produces it, but if someone in the West who's not a Muslim says a similar thing, they are called Islamophobe. Many Muslims living in the West espouse beliefs claimed to be Islamophobic if held by non-Muslims. For example, a Channel 4 survey in 2007 found that 23% of British Muslims believed the 7/7 London bombings were justified. Other surveys have showed figures more like 5%. The Pew Research in 2007 showed that 15% of younger Muslims in America believe suicide bombings are justified. But the OIC says that view that links suicide bombings with Islam is dire and threatening Islamophobia. There's a lack of reciprocity and consistency is the thread that runs through most of these objections. The OIC insists that no acts of violence or terror conducted by people in the name of Islam can have a genuine Islamic motivation. On the other hand, all forms of opposition to Islam must be viewed as manifestations of prejudice and hatred. Thus, the OIC positively stereotypes Islam and Muslims and negatively stereotypes all manifestations of rejection of Islam by non-Muslims. It is open to be concluded that this is itself a manifestation of religious prejudice. In many respects, Muslim minorities have been favoured over other religions by Western states. For example, the first mosque in the UK in central London was built on land donated by the British government in 1940, what is now the London Central Mosque. And Western governments have long invested considerable resources into outreach to Muslims. That's a long story in itself. A great deal of aid is given to Islamic states by the West with little expectation that the recipient states would address incitement and persecution of non-Muslims in their own backyards. This stands in stark contrast to the readiness of the West to agree to participate and set up complex and extensive social structures to support the Ummah's global anti-Islamophobia agenda. There's also the objection that the observatory itself could constitute incitement. Colleen LaRose, Jihad Jain, sentenced just a week or so ago, after converting to Islam in 2005, she went to Europe with the purpose of assassinating cartoonist Lars Vilks. He's been mentioned in 12 annual and monthly OIC observatory reports. There are many other incidences of attacks and violent threats against critics of Islam, such as Salman Rushdie and his publishers, Theo van Gogh, who was killed, Geert Wilders, Kurt Westergaard. To actually list someone as Islamophobe in a public list is, you could regard as a threatening act. This is the view from the OIC of what success looks like. The West needs to have a clear understanding that Islam is not a contender of Judaism or Christianity, but that it is another Abrahamic faith that flowed from the preceding faiths of Judaism and Christianity. So it's a theological outcome that is sought. The observatory would like to submit that the challenge for the OIC and Muslims is to work out a common strategy that would effectively expose the abhorrent scheme of the proponents of Islamophobia and its perilous implications on all peace-loving people of the world. This strategy would also have to confront Islamophobia by raising awareness in the West as to the core principles of peace, moderation, tolerance, benevolence that are ingrained in Islam. So what the OIC is asking is for Western nations to promote the core principles of Islam, to promote Islamic doctrines as part of the desired outcome of combating Islamophobia, to promote positive regard for Islam. You could say that this whole project is an activity of Islamic mission. The OIC-inspired program appears to construct a global infrastructure for dawah, that is a vehicle for promoting an approved set of positive beliefs about Islam under the guise of preventing racism. This campaign is itself grounded in bias, prejudice, and a rejection of any kind of genuine reciprocity between faiths for the reasons that I have already outlined. Thank you very much.
We'll have questions. Do you want to stand or sit?
I'll stand if that's
okay.
Oh, no, I'll sit if that's
all right. Yeah, we do have some time for some questions, and we are live streaming this, and so we ask you to wait for the microphone and to identify yourself when you ask the question, please.
Is that on? Yeah. Hi, Phil Scotti. I'm from the Department of State. Can you speak to any of the sort of tensions or divisions within the OIC between different groups, for example, Shia and Sunni?
I'm not aware that that has impacted their public policy strategies. They have rejected Syria and expelled it from active participation in the OIC because the stronger Sunni influence on the OIC has made Syria's position unacceptable. But as far as I can tell, its interactions with the UN and with the world are based on the principle that Sunni and Shiite Muslims should work together to address common interests.
Yeah, well, let me just add a comment to that. I agree with that, but there are signs of tensions within the OIC. I think that Katja Samuel, in her book, makes clear that there are really only a handful of active members of the OIC, and they tend to dominate the agenda and the proceeding. And that is Saudi Arabia, of course, but also Pakistan on this issue of defamation has been very active, and so has Egypt. And that there is some tension with more moderate states, although that there are a preponderance of repressive states, as both our speaker and Katja Samuel's comments, that there is a tension about what kind of punishment, for example, apostasy deserves, whether it deserves, should merit death or prison terms or some other punishment. So there is that tension going on. And then there's also the issue of currently, and this may change because the charter is in flux right now, there are state members who are not majority Muslim states. So when Mark talked about the '05 conference in Mecca, some of those members presumably couldn't attend because no non-Muslim is allowed in Mecca unless they sent a Muslim
They would have had Muslim representatives.
They would have had Muslim representatives, but
like America.
Yeah. So that there are those tensions. There is a proposal to change, or a draft to change the charter, but it hasn't been ratified yet, and that is to make the membership majority Muslim. So to resolve some of those tensions.
Definitely the Sunni bloc is much stronger. It was interesting in the debates in 2009 when the International Fiqh Academy was considering the issue of religious freedom and freedom of speech. There were a number of voices arguing against the apostasy law, that is death to people who leave Islam, in the discussions as reported in the Arab media. But the final statement affirmed the treatment of apostates in accordance with Islamic law without specifying what that meant. So there's a kind of underground debate happening, but when it comes to a public statement, it's very difficult for a shift in the position. So there are diversity of views, but that's still in a process of dynamic kind of foment, I think, within the Muslim world.
Here. And please hold the microphone close to your mouth. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Mike Kraft, counterterrorism specialist, former State Department. I have a question in terms of whether there's any irony, whether in their discussions they recognize a certain irony that, i.e., people, Christians often criticize, or some anyway, are free to criticize the Catholic Church, for example, or that in the creed of tolerance, peace, and respect, that some of the member nations, or at least their governments, are fairly active in promoting anti-Semitism. I mean, do they recognize any of the irony in this, or are they perhaps even call it hypocrisy?
I've never seen any evidence of that awareness from the leaders of the OIC. There would certainly be, for example, Arab intellectuals that have pointed out those inconsistencies. But if you look, for example, at the teaching about other religions in Saudi schools, there is no evidence that the Saudis are concerned about defamation of religion if the religion is not Islam. And that inconsistency that we would perhaps respond to by seeing the irony is extremely hard for conservative Muslims to engage with. And that's one of the fundamental problems, really, of this whole process, the lack of ability to apply a principle of equality or reciprocity, to see this through other eyes. Unfortunately, that lack of self-criticism or awareness to see this through the eyes of others has the tendency to make one quite cynical about this whole exercise.
It kind of reminds me of the old Cold War joke. Well, yes, we have the right we have the right to criticize your president too. So, remember that one?
I think it's partly a theological issue. There's a fundamental view that this is the religion of truth, and it is legitimate to criminalize criticism of it. But it's not legitimate in the same way or necessary to criminalize criticism of non-Islamic faiths because they are not the religion of truth. So it's actually this fundamentally theologically imbalanced view about relationships with faiths that determine this framework and make it quite resistant to those more kind of, you might say, Western principles of reciprocity or equality of treatment.
Thank you. Mike Kurtzig, do you see any changes in the Muslim countries in an attitude towards the West? Do you see any changes of recognizing the freedoms that we have of religion, of speech, of press, assembly, and so on, of the U.S. Constitution? Is that, because they keep on talking about democracy, I don't see any of it, but do you see anything in the school system or anything else that would make them more amenable to our standards rather than coming here and trying to foist Sharia on us? God help us all, I would say.
Well, I think there have been and are ongoing debates in the Muslim world about those issues, and many people living in Islamic states do admire values of the West, and sometimes that's very difficult for them. Many Iranians are very open to Western values and are often intensely critical of Islam and at least their experience of the version of Islam that they've experienced, that they've found. So yes, there is a lot of criticism and debate, but that's occurring against the backdrop of what I referred to as the Islamic revival, the Islamic movement, which is to restore the lost greatness of Islam through re-emphasizing classical, traditional Islamic values. And that has been in the ascendancy in recent decades. The Muslim Brotherhood is one manifestation of that. The Islamic Revolution in Iran is another. So it's the momentum that the global Islamic movement has is still strong. There is a reaction against that. You see that in Iran today, but that also exists in other countries in the Middle East as well. And the Muslim Brotherhood, having proclaimed that Islam is the solution for a long time, was removed from office by the request of the people and the action of the army after a relatively short period of time. So that will create questions and debate amongst Muslims and non-Muslims about the efficacy of the Islamic solution. So I think the worldview of the Islamic world with respect to Islam is quite unstable at the present time and in flux. And the OIC is a manifestation of a global Islamic revival that perhaps has peaked already but still has considerable clout to it. How it will fare in the longer term is a challenge. And I think the fissures within the Muslim world will also be a challenge to the OIC maintaining its ability to speak, as it were, for the whole global ummah.
Yeah, I want to point out also that there are important voices in the Muslim world who are trying to raise these issues. And one was the great former president of Indonesia, the late Abdurrahman Wahid, who wrote the forward to Paul's and my book, which I'm very proud of, and also other scholars like Abdullah Saeed, who contributed to the concluding chapters of that book, and arguing from a theological point of view about why God does not need a defense, as Wahid's chapter was called, about why there should be freedom of expression and how dangerous it was to close down debate. And we're trying to actually, in our Center for Religious Freedom right now is trying to promote these discussions. Paul has traveled in the Muslim world where Muslim countries, he went to Indonesia and other countries, and we have the book translated now in Arabic, so we're going to be making it available for free to the Arabic world, speaking world. over here.
Roberta Gluck. I'm trying to get a handle on why Hillary Clinton in the United States would take such a visible position within the OIC. I certainly understand why it's very important for us to have universal understanding of the world of Islam and to support anti-defamation activities that some in the United States engage in. But as you describe the goals of the OIC, it seems so anti-democratic and anti-our Western values that I'm seeing a disconnect between Hillary Clinton and the United States government's role and what the OIC stands for. Help me out with that, please.
2 points. One is, I think Obama's policy, which Hillary has accepted, is that, or did accept, was that to reduce tensions across the religious divides, it was necessary to reach out to and accommodate Islamic concerns. So, to her credit, Hillary Clinton did emphasize freedom of religion in the speeches that she gave and her dialogue with Muslims. I think she believed that she could challenge them to have a higher tolerance for freedom and that the dialogue would be useful as a channel of influence. At the same time, I think her worldview is that religion is not a significant cause of human behavior, that the fundamental causes would be poverty, political disadvantage, and so on. This was a view, maybe it's unfair to jump to Bill Clinton, but his view about the explanation of Boko Haram's violent attacks on Christians in Nigeria was that poverty and lack of opportunity was the cause. So there is a denial of the role of religion as a causative factor. So if you believe that religion is not a cause for human endeavour, and for example, that it does not motivate the OIC, but the OIC is primarily concerned about the disadvantage and the sufferings of Muslims in the world as a kind of social justice project, then there is nothing to investigate. There is no religious ideology that's of interest to the process of getting to know one another and making a safer world. So that is part of a symptom of a broader religious illiteracy in the West and an unwillingness to engage with religion as a significant motivator of human behaviour. And I think that's a big challenge for us. And it's something that the work of people in the Hudson Institute and others elsewhere have challenged and will continue to challenge. And it's really a long process for us in the West to be able to integrate discussion of politics with engagement with religious principles in a way that's humane and gracious and reasonable.
You know, I agree with that entirely. And in fact, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, after the Boko Haram attack, this was Assistant Secretary of President Obama administration, after a particularly vicious Boko Haram attack, gave a speech at CSIC, another think tank, CCSIS, another think tank here in Washington, saying that, exactly that. So there were, and saying that it was because of poor government distribution of resources that provoked this violence, and that this had nothing to do with religion, quote unquote. That said, you know, I think it's deeply disturbing, and you're right, Secretary Clinton did talk about how the solution to insult to Islam was more discussion, more talk, not closing down talk. She said that over and over again, and I welcomed hearing that because I think that is right, that is a solution. You know, on the other hand, you had this sort of creative arrest of the Benghazi, at the time of the Benghazi attacks, of the Egyptian Coptic filmmaker in Los Angeles, because he made an insulting film, and that man went to prison, federal prison for you know, some creative reason, but it was, everyone knew it was because of his association with that film.
Can I also, just a few more comments, it's such an important and interesting point. The OIC has an agenda which is to really criminalize criticism of Islam, but they can't apply that framework to the West. So they're working through United Nations human rights frameworks which are not actually set up for that purpose. And there's a disconnect between their ideological goals and the language and the framework that they're working through. And in a way, Hillary Clinton was saying, look, this is the framework we're working with. This is the UN Declaration of Human Rights we're talking about. But I think on the Muslim side, they're well aware of that. And they are not stupid. They understand that the UN's declaration is different from the OIC's. So I think that they would have a tin ear to those requests, because the whole exercise is constructed because they're aware that there are such differences. The other thing I want to say is Hillary Clinton gave an interesting speech on freedom of religion. And the essence of her speech was that the real danger to religious freedom is people who believe their beliefs are correct. Because they are extremist, and it is extremism that is the challenge to freedom, not what people believe, but that they hold those beliefs extremely. Now, this is like a meme or an idea that just rattles around the Western mind, and it's an extremely bad idea. The implication is Mother Teresa is as dangerous to religious freedom as Osama bin Laden, because they both believe they are right. And that idea that religion, it doesn't really matter what you believe, and all beliefs are the same, but to believe it extremely is extremely threatening and dangerous for the world, is very flawed. And that's a damaged worldview. It's an incompetent worldview held by an intelligent person. And then when you're engaging with a theologically constructed system like the OIC, you are just flying blind into something, and you're playing a role which you do not understand what role you're playing and the impact of what you're doing.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Go ahead, Faith McDonald.
Hi, Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Thanks so much for your speech. And I fear that many churches in the West are contributing to what the OIC is trying to do. That, as you said, they can't do it in certain frameworks, but some churches, which really haven't spoken up for persecuted Christians around the world, are making it easier for them. And I was just wondering if you could say something about the effect of Western churches following this narrative of Islamophobia so closely.
I think religious dialogue is an important venue for promoting Islamic values. It's a bridge. Sayyid Qutb said it's a one-way bridge. The Runnymede documents, there were 2 clergy who were on that, a Christian clergy who contributed to it. So I think Christians have been contributing to the anti-Islamophobia project. I would challenge the church to be more aware of the situation of Christians, to have some courage to stand up for them and to appreciate the reasons for their plight, and to investigate what are the teachings that might, or the ideas that might have contributed to their sufferings. I'd encourage them also not to be so frightened about losing relationship or damaging dialogue. I think we need some more robustness in dialogue in order for it to be real. I also think they should have more compassion for Muslims. When the Archbishop of Canterbury said that Sharia law should be embraced because it's not like it's an alien system to the British system of justice, I think he was influenced by a lot of Abrahamic dialogue. But the victims of that, his claim, are Muslim women in the UK whose issues will be dealt with by Sharia courts. And if he had more sympathy or compassion for some of the problems that Muslims face, he might have more courage to speak up on behalf of Muslims. And this is a really important issue, that it is not freedom for Muslims to be compelled to be Sharia compliant. If they have a religious objection to Islam, they should have the right not to have to be subjected to Sharia norms, just like non-Muslims. So I think there's a big task of education needed. And I think people are intimidated by these issues as well. They're afraid.
Right in the back. It's our last question.
Is there a question?
Are we really
I mean, well, okay.
I think Nina has, Nina has something to say.
Let me just say that, you know, that's what we're trying to do today. We're trying to give, and Mark Dury has really given us some deeper analysis. There is some naivete, but it's also, we're just beginning to understand the OIC, and maybe the OIC is evolving as well in a way that is very uncertain about becoming a more important player on the world stage. So I'm very happy that Mark was able to join us today to give us his insights and his scholarship. And what?
Can I say one?
Yeah,
one
yes,
thing?
yes, go ahead.
I think the dialogue is extremely important with the Muslim world. And Prince Charles gave us a great example because he basically said in his statement just around Christmas, there's been a huge investment in interfaith dialogue, in building bridges. But that is being put at risk. The fruits of that are being put at risk by Christian suffering in the Middle East. And I think it's a good time and it's appropriate for Christians in the West and leaders in the West to say, we can't just deal with Islamophobia in a vacuum as if there wasn't also issues of human rights for all religious groups. And that dialogue needs to be progressed. I think that will be good for Muslims and their freedom as well as good for people in the West. It injects a mode of reality into these processes. I have really a great deal of hope about the future and about the progress that can happen, but I don't think it's going to be easy, but it's necessary to have these discussions and to develop channels of communication in order to express these concerns.
Thank you so much, Mark.